Szósta sesja naszego sympozjum jest kolejną sesją ekspercką. Wykład wygłosi dr Andrzej Kowalczyk z Instytutu Anglistyki Uniwersytetu Marii Curie-Skłodowskiej. Bardzo się z tego serdecznie cieszę. A będzie to wykład poświęcony Charlesowi Williamsowi. Tak jak tutaj rozmawialiśmy przed chwilą z panem doktorem, nie ma ani jednej książki Charlesa Williamsa przetłumaczonej na język polski. Człowiek nieznany, ale przecież mający wpływ. Kilka miesięcy temu w końcu się zdobyłem na przeczytanie Teologii kosmicznej i kiedy przeczytałem tę Ohydną siłę, książkę, o której wiedziałem, że tam jest mocny wpływ Williamsa, zacząłem się zastanawiać, jak wielki był wpływ inklingów na to, jak my pojmujemy wiarę. Ja tam wyspecjalizowałem się w Tolkienie, ktoś bardziej kocha Lewisa, ale żeby zrozumieć ich, trzeba także sięgnąć po Williamsa. I ten temat pan doktor nam przybliży. Za to już teraz serdecznie dziękuję i proszę bardzo o wygłoszenie
Dziękuję
referatu.
bardzo. Bardzo dziękuję za zaproszenie. To dla mnie prawdziwy zaszczyt. I chciałbym jeszcze obalić jeden mit właśnie o konkurencji między KUL-em a UMCS-em. Przynajmniej jeśli chodzi o anglistykę, my naprawdę ze sobą bardzo ściśle współpracujemy. Prowadzimy razem projekty naukowe. Mogę chyba powiedzieć, że mam przyjaciół wśród anglistów kulowskich, także pewne stereotypy są nieprawdą. Proszę Państwa, poproszono mnie, żebym ten wykład przygotował po angielsku, ale mam tutaj też takie dziękuję bardzo, handouty po polsku, jakieś najważniejsze tezy. Z jednej rzeczy chciałbym się jeszcze wytłumaczyć. Ten wykład siłą rzeczy nie będzie literaturoznawczy. Ja nie będę Państwu mówił o swoich badaniach nad prozą Williamsa, bo nie mam na to czasu i to by wymagało zupełnie innego wprowadzenia. Dwa słowa tylko o tym, czym ja się zajmuję. Ja próbuję badać powieści Williamsa przy pomocy poetyki kognitywnej, to znaczy próbuję badać jego prozę, szukając odpowiedzi na pytanie, w jaki sposób Williams komunikuje doświadczenie religijne, ale jeszcze na poziomie właśnie mentalnym, czyli zajmuje się pewnymi zjawiskami takimi, które są może nawet jeszcze podjęzykowe, typu przestrzenie mentalne, typu integracja konceptualna i o tym dzisiaj nie będę mówił, bo to by wymagało zupełnie innego wprowadzenia. Natomiast chciałbym dzisiaj przybliżyć Państwu Williamsa i powiedzieć o tym, co Państwa jako teologów może bardziej interesować. Okay, so now I'm going to switch into English. And I'd like to begin with a paradox. It is really surprising that in light of the popularity of Tolkien's and C.S. Lewis's works, well, actually Williams can be termed as a forgotten inkling. When I started writing on Williams some 10 years ago, and when I attended conferences, one of the first questions was, "Excuse me, Charles who?" So, you know, even in Britain, there were people who knew next to nothing about Charles Williams. But, you know, this is a Tolkien conference, a conference on Tolkien, so I'd like to begin with Tolkien's attitude towards Williams. And as one of critics says, this attitude was somewhat uneasy, and I like the phrase very much. It's pretty British to me, and it covers a lot. But actually, what we have is again, this is often quoted also in the Polish version of Carpenter's Inklings. We've got Tolkien's margin notes on his copy of essays presented to Charles Williams. This is a collection of essays published 2 years after Williams's death in 1947. And in the introduction, C.S. Lewis writes, quote, Williams had already become as dear to all my Oxford friends as he was to me, to which Tolkien says, alas, no. And elsewhere, C.S. Lewis says, writing about Williams, in every circle that he entered, he gave the whole man. And again, Tolkien says, no, I think not. Also, in an interview, I think it was 1965 or something like that, with Resnick, Resnick's interview with Tolkien, again, Tolkien admits that although he knows a lot of books by Williams, he doesn't quite like them. So there is a kind of distance between the two, and I hope to be able to answer this question, the question why, what made, or what could have made Tolkien be, let's say, somewhat uneasy as far as Williams was concerned. A few words about Williams. These are just facts, but I think they tell us a lot about what kind of man we are dealing with. Now, Williams was born in London, and he spent in London the greater part of his life. He had to move to St. Albans. This is a small town in the north, because his father was suffering from an illness. There was a danger of losing sight, and doctors suggested moving from London towards a more nicer place in the countryside. Now, formally, and I would like to stress the word formally, Williams was a member of the Church of England, the High Church. Himself, he read a number of, Catholic works, also theological works. He quoted a number of Catholic thinkers. He was baptized, he was confirmed in the church, and according to his biographers, he was a devout member of the Church of England. Now, one interesting thing connected with his early years is perhaps his kind of fantasy, just like Lewis and some other important English writers. He created a kind of imaginary kingdom called Sylvania, and with his sister they used to prepare performances. This was like a Catholic medieval-like place with a set of rules, and obviously with certain religious underpinning. Now, in terms of education, this is also an interesting thing, because actually he was a self-made man. He graduated from St. Albans Grammar School, and he started his studies in a university college in London, but because of financial problems, he never managed to finish it. So actually, what he learned was due to his own studies, was due to his conversations with his father, and it was owing to his work as an editor later on. Just out of curiosity, I think you might be interested in it, that while in St. Albans, he belonged to an informal church discussion group called Theological Smokers. And as the very name suggests, he and his friends used to discuss certain theological aspects over a mug of beer and smokes, cigarettes and pipes. So, again, probably the most important thing was his job for the Oxford University Press in London, in the so-called Amen Corner or Amen House. Later on, he started as a proofreader, but later on, in a way, he made his career, pursued his career, and became an important editor. And we might say that it was his whole world. In a way, he spent, according to his biographers and according to what we know about him from his letters, he used to spend some, 15 hours each day working there and reading and also writing. So actually he used to come back home quite late just to have enough time for supper, and then again he continued writing poetry, and he used to wake up his wife late at night just to read passages to her, 2 o'clock, things like that. But also he was a lecturer. He was a very popular lecturer. He worked for the London County Council. He delivered a number of lectures connected with the greatest names in the history of English literature, Milton, first of all, but not only, Shakespeare as well. Now, again, an important date is connected with the Second World War, because he had to move to Oxford. Oxford University Press, the branch, the London branch, had to move back to Oxford, and Williams went there with his friends, and it was in Oxford that he met the Inklings, and also he became an active member of the group. Again, because of the war, he became a university lecturer without a university degree. So it's not a typical thing, but he got his honorary MA only in 1943. So this is like a sketch, the official biography. And now I would like to move on to 2 controversial issues as far as his life is concerned. And the first one is like the first dark page in the history of his life, is his connection with the occult. Again, according to his biographers, in 1916 he was made responsible, or he got involved in the production of a collection of metaphysical poems, or shall we say occult poems. The title was the Oxford Book of Mystical Verse. And probably because of this, he got involved, he got in touch with certain important figures, such as Waite. Again, I don't know how much you know about that period, but Waite belonged to a very famous or infamous, depending on the perspective, society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Waite himself was interested in alchemy, in ceremonial magic, in the Holy Grail, in the tarot. Actually, he invented, or he's responsible for, this is what I've learned, for one of the most popular decks of tarot, which is used till the present day. But according to his biographers, he was against using black magic, and he quarreled with the founding fathers of the order, and he started his own kind of splinter group called the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross, Bractwo Różokrzyża, and it is this organization, it is this society that Williams joined. Well, Waite is usually characterized as esoteric Christian. I know that to many of us this might be controversial. To many Christians this is actually oxymoronic, talking about esoteric Christianity. But in his case, I think what is important is that actually he was a student rather than a practitioner, and certainly he wasn't interested in satanic concepts that, for example, Aleister Crowley would follow, Crowley the Beast. So, again, obviously secret societies, as the very name suggests, they are secret, so we don't know much about how important this was in Williams's experience. I think it was quite important. I think it was more important than many critics admit, which shows especially in his novels. These novels are quite often interpreted from the perspective of his later theological works. That is, if critics find some controversial elements in the novels, they usually tend to explain them through Williams's later theology. But if you treat these novels just as literary texts, that is, if you look at them, I think not only the structure, but quite often the spiritual essence has a lot to share with the occult or with the esoteric. So this is one thing. He, according to biographers, again, he was quite an important person. Probably he spent there are different accounts, but up to 10 years in this society, and he became a Magister Templum, so quite an important person. He reached an important level of occult initiation, if I can say so. He was also talking about God's magic or God's alchemy. Now, the other controversy is connected with Williams's attitude towards women. And the most scathing attack, this is like the essence of this criticism, comes from Freudian critics. And there is especially one book by Andrea Freud Lowenstein called Loathsome Jews and Engulfing Women. And in it, she tries to destroy the myth of Williams. She says Williams was just, and I quote, an obsessive-compulsive who ritualized sadism towards women. She uses, when she writes about his romantic theology, she uses inverted commas. When she writes about his Christian attitude, she uses inverted commas. So she completely, she doesn't agree with this official image of Williams. She says he formalized his mechanisms of defense as a unique Christian philosophy. So she believes, in other words, that this Christian philosophy was only a kind of cover-up. His preoccupation with the myth amounted to an obsession, she argues, which enabled Williams to distance himself from the real people in his life. And especially, this statement is based on Williams's letters. And she says that actually Williams's relationship with his wife was a stormy one, and that William got involved with, again, very, very specific relationships with his female students. These were not sexual relationships because he had a special theory behind this, but actually, as a husband, I see this quite strange. Like he used to share his deepest feelings with the students, with the female students, rather than with his wife, which is kind of questionable. And Andrea Freud Lowenstein goes as far as saying that Williams may have been an energy or psychic vampire, that actually he may have used some occult practices in order to drain his students, his female students. And that's why, she says, Williams couldn't really merge with the Inklings, because Inklings were men, and they were independent. So she says, on the one hand, Williams was afraid of real women, and that's why he created his myths, and that's why he invented names for women, mythical names. But at the same time, he couldn't, if he couldn't control these women, he simply stopped the relationships. Well, this is a controversy. Again, later on maybe I will show you just one book. There is a biography, a recent biography which was published just before Christmas. It's a bulky volume But in it, these two aspects are also underscored. So Williams as a student of the occult, and Williams as a controversial person in his relationships with women. Okay, works fairly quickly. He was a very prolific writer. He wrote poetry. He wrote verse drama. Actually, I started my adventure with Williams with drama. Again, these are verse plays with religious elements in them, and they are quite outstanding. Sadly, Williams is not mentioned in the major histories of modern drama at all. I've got, again, a collection of, this is a biographical work, but also a collection of essays, modern in British drama, and Williams is not mentioned there at all. He was a literary critic as well, writing about Milton, about poetry, about Shakespeare, about romantic love, and about the importance of the topos of the city, and many, many other things, also about crime fiction. Now, he's also the author of theological works, and a number of critics who try to interpret Williams's literary texts, they do it exactly from the perspective of his theology. One of the most famous texts is Outlines of Romantic Theology, in which he discusses the relationships between religion and romantic love. I'm going to talk about it later on. Also, He Came Down from Heaven, the Descent of the Dove, which is like the history of the Holy Spirit in the Church. A book called Witchcraft, which is not really the history of witchcraft, but rather a history of the Church's attitude towards witchcraft. And The Forgiveness of Sins. I guess the title is self-explanatory. Now, sorry. To the point. He's also the author of the 7 novels. The novels which are more frequently referred to as supernatural thrillers or even theological shockers. I guess the word thriller is used not so much in the modern sense, in the sense of the popular genre, so it doesn't really deal with the pace of action, but rather, as I understand it, with this element of a shock, of a cognitive shock, and perhaps of a religious or spiritual shock that his characters and perhaps the reader experienced. Again, sadly, they haven't been translated into Polish, so we've got only the original versions, War in Heaven, Many Dimensions, The Place of the Lion, The Greater Trumps, Shadow of Ecstasy, Descent into Hell, and All Hallows Eve. And if you have a look at the English titles, I think they tell you a lot about the content. They tell you a lot about Williams's interests and about Williams's religious or spiritual quest. Again, before we criticize Williams, I think we need to understand something about the times in which he was creating. And because, on the one hand, it is true that he may have been unorthodox. Some people would, they go as far as saying that he wasn't really a Christian, that he represents a kind of New Age philosophy. But on the other hand, I think we should focus upon what is good about these books, good in the sense of the spiritual development. And the quotation you've got here comes from one of his books, The Place of the Lion. And in it, again, I've chosen it on purpose because one of the characters is a theology student. a doctoral student of theology, Damaris. She's writing a dissertation, a PhD dissertation, and strange things start happening in her life. And she's got a boyfriend, Anthony, but actually, at least in the first part of the book, she's not really interested in him. She's not really interested in love. She treats him instrumentally because he's responsible for a literary magazine, and she wants her articles to be published there. So this is the beginning of this relationship. But, so what you see here is a quotation, Anthony's words, which I believe to a great degree reflect Williams's perspective. And Anthony tries to justify Damaris. He says, quote, "But she didn't know, she didn't understand. It wasn't her fault. It was the fault of her time, her culture, her education, the pseudo-knowledge that affected all the learned, the pseudo-skepticism that infected all the unlearned, in the age of pretense, and she was only pretending as everybody else did in this lost and imbecile century." And I think this is a good context to understand the role of Williams in awakening this quest for spirituality, maybe not exactly Christian spirituality or not always Christian spirituality, but this is a kind of defense. And now let me talk about the key concepts in the novels, because this is the title of my presentation today. Again, I don't have time to discuss all of them. These are really fascinating texts. My students like them very much, and I fell in love with them, although they are quite difficult. Someone says you either hate Williams or you love him, so I belong to the lovers. The first concept underlying these texts might be called natural supernaturalism. Now, in other words, there seems to be no conflict between these two aspects of reality, or between these two realities. Quite often when we deal with fantastic fiction, we've got a kind of clash of the words. We've got a clash between the natural and the supernatural. In the case of Williams, it doesn't work like that. True, there is a moment of eruption of the supernatural in the life of a particular person. But actually, it turns out that the whole world is connected. I mean, the visible is connected with the invisible. So the point is to discover, to be able to discover this underlying layer, shall I say, of the universe. And in other words, what can be perceived by the senses and by reason only turns out to be a part of the whole. And actually, what is beyond, what is transcendent, becomes the world's essence. A few examples. In the book called Many Dimensions, we've got an element which is called materia prima, which is the alchemical element from which, according to different theories, the universe, out of which universe was created. And it appears in the world, it appears in London, it appears in the 20th century England in the form of a stone, the stone of the Suleiman or Solomon. And again, at first, it is a kind of cognitive shock. How come? We've got cars, we've got the tube, we've got radio, I think, in the novel, and suddenly you've got an element like that, which apparently destroys this verisimilitude. It is difficult to suspend this disbelief, let's say. But it turns out that actually the whole world the Williams presents is created out of this. And exactly this element, this stone, is the source of different worlds, parallel worlds, quite often. So the point is what to do with this knowledge, and the point is how to use the power. In Williams's novels, especially in these early novels, if there is such an artifact, if there is the supernatural object, again it becomes the object of a quest between, two powers, basically between the people who want to use it for their own purposes and between the people who want to keep it as it is because it belongs to this natural order of the universe. So this is what happens in many dimensions. We've got the uses and abuses of power in this case. But it's not a gadget. It's not a supernatural gadget. It's never an element which is just, like something additional, something to make these novels more popular. I think it is always connected with a deeper philosophical or religious understanding of certain important questions, like who are we? Who is the Creator? What is the relationship between ourselves and the Creator? In another novel, The Place of the Lion, we've got a situation in which Platonic ideas or archetypes or angelicals, as they are called in the novel, they suddenly appear in this world. So again, we begin with 20th century England. We have this motive or this theme of Damaris writing her PhD dissertation, discussing theological things, and suddenly it turns out that in this world there appear giant animals, the lion, the butterfly, symbolizing the qualities out of which, again, this world was created. So it's not a clash of the worlds, but rather it's like, a moment of epiphany, in a word, a moment of understanding that this world is based upon something else, something immaterial, something spiritual. And there is a question, again, of what to do with this discovery. There are people who would simply like to serve these images. And Anthony becomes a new Adam in this novel, and he brings them back, brings these ideas back to their reality, bridging the gap between the worlds. And this gap was opened by an occult figure, again, a kind of guru. It's not really stated in the novel, but it's suggested that because of his occult practices, it was possible to bring these ideas back into the world. Well, in the novel, The Greater Trumps, the essence of the world is presented through the concept of the tarot. So the book is organized according to certain images, the Greater Trumps, images of the major arcana, I think. Arcana, I think they are called in English. To są te figury w tarocie. So we've got a certain correspondence between certain characters and the cards. But again, the whole world, the mechanism of the world depends on the infinite dance. The dance which is like the driving force behind the world. And the particular characters discover this truth. They also experience a kind of metaphysical shock because their world suddenly turns out to be just a surface of something much deeper. But again, this is not like, supernatural trappings. This is not a kind of decoration. Williams uses this motive or this structure in order to introduce a conflict in the individual, in the soul of an individual. So the question is what to do about it. If we depend on others, then each decision we take leads us, in fact, either to salvation or towards salvation or damnation. So each single gesture matters. Again, in the book which I personally admire the most, Descent into Hell, we've got, again, London, the 20th century London, the place called the Battlefield, which is like the suburb. And suddenly it turns out that through this place, we've got a temporal unity with previous times. We've got the generations of the dead still living there, as it were. So it's like, the unity of the universe, the world of the living being connected intrinsically with the world of the dead. And it is possible to communicate spiritually with the dead. It is possible to save them. It is possible to share our love with them, although, technically speaking, or according to temporal perspective, they died a long time ago. And this is what one of the characters does, actually saving her ancestor, taking his fear. I'm going to talk about it later, so let me move on to one more example. In All Hallows Eve, again we've got a magician, Simon Leclerc, who is a kind of guru. He's got a number of religious followers, and he tries to use the souls in order to control afterlife. In this novel we've got something rather strange, something which might be perhaps equivalent to our Catholic purgatory, although it is not named a purgatory, czyściec, right? But there is a kind of space, or there is a kind of reality in which the souls of the dead exist. It is not heaven yet, it is not hell, it is something in between. And this magician, Simon, he wants to control this area, this reality, in order to exercise his power in the real world, in this mimetic world. So again, when you look at these things from that perspective, it looks like, well, fantastic novels. It looks like novels based upon certain esoteric or even occult aspects or ideas. But in all these novels, there is also a sense of Christianity involved, I believe. So Williams never praises dark or black magic. He never praises the dark side of reality. He cuts himself off from these magicians, although he is he's really convincing in his descriptions of certain occult phenomena, like the Black Mass, for example, in one of the novels. Okay, now another thing is sacramentalism, and again, I'm sorry, I'm not a theologian, so I have to explain what critics mean by that. Probably you understand sacramentalism in a different way, that is in connection with certain Christian ideas. I think in his case we can talk about, critics use the term in a broader sense, according to which things in this world suggest meanings beyond themselves. So it is possible for us to share in this outer reality because of certain objects or because of or due to certain rituals. Also, he describes a number of characters sharing in the life of Christ, or in the life of Adam, or even in the life of Satan. So this is a kind of, obviously, we wouldn't associate Satan with sacramentalism, especially here, but what I mean is this kind of more general idea permeating his novels. But he also offers beautiful descriptions of the liturgy. Very powerful, cognitively rich descriptions of sacraments now in the Christian sense. But again, just to give you a couple of examples, in War in Heaven, we've got the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail is an object which belongs to all these levels of reality. You know, it exists in this 20th century world as a chalice, as a material object. But at the same time, it partakes in this, supernatural reality, if I can say so. And it represents both Christ and Christians, and there is a figure of Prester John, the Grail keeper, who is also an important character in the novel. And again, the point is what to do with this fact, how to react towards it in spiritual terms. What can you do about the fact that there is the Holy Grail appears in England? There are some people who would like to use the power of the chalice, just in order to control others. There is a Catholic who is presented with a little bit of irony, someone who wants to keep it, to bring the chalice to Rome because he naturally belongs to the Pope. So someone who would like to, in a way, restrict the power of the Grail to one particular denomination. But also we've got an Anglican priest who understands that the power of the Grail, as Williams calls it, doesn't come from itself in a way, that it is only exactly, it's like a sacramental representation of something else. So he, for example, he can exchange this Grail for the sake of someone else's health. He's offered a choice. One of these evildoers says, give me the chalice and I will help the woman. And he does it because he doesn't treat this relic, as a precious object in itself. He knows that, in fact, any chalice, any cup can perform a similar, can convey similar function. In many dimensions, the book I have mentioned, Anthony exactly becomes a new Adam. We've got a beautiful description of a scene in which he, in a way, comes back to paradise. It happens again in a kind of reality which is difficult to describe. We don't know to which of the worlds it belongs. And using the power given to him by God, Anthony, this new Adam, names again the archetypes, names the animals, just like the biblical Adam. And in that way, he controls them and he calls them back to their own reality. Okay. Then romantic love. Again, probably one of the most interesting and controversial concepts in the novels. Williams argues that we can experience God's transcendence through earthly love. In other words, a union between a man and a woman reflects a union between man and God. So, and everything matters. How you look at a woman, what you say to her, your internal attitude, everything has this secondary meaning, and everything, any single moment, I think we might say, decides, helps you or pushes you either towards salvation or damnation. Even more importantly, he often shows the lack of this love in the form of idolatry or self-idolatry, in the form of concentrating on oneself. And again, there is a historian in one of the books, a historian who falls in love with a younger girl, but this love cannot be realized because the girl has a boyfriend. And he creates mentally the image of the girl, a kind of succubus. And he gets involved in the relationship with this being who looks like the woman, like Adela, who satisfies his sexual needs, but actually who is intrinsically devilish and empty. So in this case, if you, in other words, if you don't love, or if you do not accept the principle of love, you start loving yourself, and you this is the first step on the path to hell. I think in all these novels, the relationship between a man and a woman is crucial, and we've got both married couples, we've got fiancés, we've got people in love, we've got friendship as a kind of love, also friendship between a man and a woman, and we've got also people who reject love for various reasons. In his first novel, Shadows of Ecstasy, there is again a magician who believes in what is called the transmutation of energy. So he believes that sexual energy, unrealized sexual energy, can be changed into the power of immortality. So it's quite queer and very interesting. Anyway, now another important concept in the novels is what Williams and critics call substitution exchange, or substituted love. Now, and it comes from it is a reinterpretation of St. Paul's statement in the epistle to the Galatians: bear ye one another's burdens. But to Williams, it doesn't really mean listen sympathetically to others, be good to others. Williams understands it in a literal way, in a direct way. He believes, and both as an author and as a person, that it is possible to exchange certain problems. So, for example, if I'm stressed out today, if I'm afraid of talking to you, and one of you decides to help me, he or she can take my fear in a literal sense. So I'm going to lose it. I'm going to, to be free because someone else decides to help me with this. This is what we have in the novels. This is described in Descent into Hell. But also, Williams practiced this in his own life. He founded a company, of a kind of society, in which his followers, especially his female students, were supposed to, to deal with this and to practice this kind of spiritual exercise, if I can put it like that. In the novel, so in Descent into Hell, there is a figure of Peter Stanhope. He's a poet, probably like Williams himself, who says that, carrying these burdens should be understood like carrying a parcel, and this is the actual word he uses, like a parcel, something that we can take out of a person and help him or her. And it is very interesting because in this novel we've got this idea of substitution or exchange presented in a way which transcends time. So actually Pauline, the protagonist, she's able to help her ancestor. There is a person called John Strather, a Protestant martyr, who was to be burnt at the stake. And he's afraid, there is a historical document which shows his fear, that he was afraid of fire. And it is possible for Pauline, she decides in a way to help him, and he is relieved, and he sees in a kind of vision, Williams presents it in a beautiful vision in which he says, I saw the glory of God. So his fear disappears. Now, a similar idea is coherence. Critics believe this derives from the Trinitarian principle, so from the union between the three persons of God, three Godheads. And Williams says the whole world, the whole universe is coherent. So there is an intrinsic relationship between the Creator, between his creatures, and between all the creation. There is a kind of interdependence, there is a kind of indwelling, there is a kind of, one of the critics says, I quote, a kind of continuous charity, caritas, in this sense. And it also operates on the level of a particular person, so it is a connection between a body and spirit. There is a connection between individuals, a husband and a wife. This coherence works in social and in political life. So, in other words, it's a vision according to which, as I understand it at least, universe is a whole, and we are parts of it, and we should be aware of this, and we should consciously try and take part in it. It's a kind of universal principle. Okay. Now, sin. As I have said, sin is understood in an intellectual way. Sin, in Williams's novels, is a decision. Sin is a decision to withdraw from society, to withdraw from this circle of coherence. Sin is a moment of choosing your own pleasure rather than accepting the order of the world. So Williams's sinners are selfish people. In a way, they are, well, it depends on the novel, but they are not villains. Quite often they are not villains in the classic sense of the word. They are wrongdoers who have made a certain mistake and who cannot, and this is even more important, that they cannot learn or they don't want to learn from their mistakes. On the other hand, Williams believes that, okay, we are sinners, but we are redeemed sinners. So in all these cases, in all the novels, it is possible for a sinner to change his attitude. And sometimes it is possible to change evil into good. This is a very curious thing, but again, in War in Heaven, there is a Satanist, Gregory Persimmons, someone who's a devoted Satanist, someone who believes Satan is his master, someone who treats Satan personally as his Lord, someone who prays to Satan. But Williams says, still there is a chance, there is a hope for Persimmons because he was sincere, because he had some religious passion. It was a misguided passion, but still this passion in a way may save him. We don't know what is going to happen to him, but there is a sentence in which Prester John, this Holy Grail, the keeper of the Holy Grail, says that you will get what you wanted, but you can interpret it in a positive sense. Especially that in the same novel we've got two nihilists for whom there is no possibility of salvation. Then the city, which is again a very complex idea, Williams ponders on it in his theological and critical texts later on, but the city is a kind of metaphor, or maybe a symbol. Yeah, a symbol is a better word here, because in a way it exists in this world, but also it is a part of the reality it symbolizes. So the city as a community of a new creation, the city as a community of co-inherent souls, the city as a community of people who are interested in spiritual development, who are interested in spiritual relationships, and who are also interested in, because of that, they are interested in relationships evident or conspicuous in this world. So again, we might talk about Pauline Strether and about this community. You know, here at Battle Hill, the city unites the world of the dead with the worlds of the living, and also with the vision of the future. She's got a grandmother, Pauline, and this elderly woman is probably a female equivalent of this white wizard in a way. She's a religious person, but in the deeply spiritual sense. She understands this connection between the layers of universe, and actually she has a vision of what I believe is heaven. Not only of this world of the dead, but also a kind of, this is a fascinating scene in which she becomes, in a way, a mountain. And we've got a vision of mountains in the sun. And there is a moment in which Williams actually departs from English syntax. He was accused of using non-English sentences, but actually in this vision he might reach a kind of mystical experience up to a point, certainly not in the sense that we discussed in the morning, but it's something which is beyond language. It is something which transgresses the level of language which describes things. I think it shows, it tries to demonstrate certain things rather than only describing them. A great book anyway. And finally, something which I personally regard as particularly interesting is a note of skepticism, a dialectic mode in his novels. That is, his novels, I think it's unjust to call them religious propaganda. Hostile critics say, come on, you cannot read, you cannot understand these novels if you don't have this boring, as they say, Christian set of ideas or worldview. But I think it doesn't work like that. It's much more complex and much more interesting, because in his novels there are many voices. There are characters representing different perspectives. So on the one hand, a particular idea is affirmed, but on the other hand, you have a character who questions it. And it's up to you, it's up to the reader to arrive at kind of to find some common denominator, or to simply to find your own interpretation. And that is why it is possible to interpret certain novels either as Christian or as hermetic. For example, following these occult or alchemical principles, or it is possible to see both in them, and I think this is just. So in some of the text, perhaps you've got a question mark here, because perhaps the effect verges on what Bakhtin calls polyphony, that is a number of different voices, and it is not really possible to decide which of these voices predominates. True, Williams's narrators are quite straightforward. Quite often, they seem to represent Williams himself rather than this perspective in a novel, and this is what Williams is often accused of. But on the other hand, I think this is an open text. I mean, these are open texts in the sense that Professor Milbank discussed yesterday. So as a literary scholar, I find in these novels a number of interpretative possibilities. I find them a truly fascinating object of study. And although I don't agree with all the ideas as a Christian, as a Catholic, still I believe that what is important is raising of the question. You know, at that time, if we realize what the mainstream literature was at that time, we might say, well, Nietzsche's phrase, God is dead, characterizes a number of mainstream books. So Williams and the Inklings, they tried to ask these very important spiritual questions, not necessarily following orthodox Christian ideas. So finally, as a kind of summary, I'd like to quote one of the critics who says, and I think it's the best summary of what I was trying to tell you. Metcalfe says, there is little doubt that no one is likely to be able to read Williams who has not some kind of religious feeling. Not that Williams's writing is religion without literature, but that what he is saying needs some religious capacity to be understood. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję serdecznie panu doktorowi za wspaniałe przedłożenie właśnie tego tematu o Charlesie Williamsie i otwieram dyskusję. Kto by chciał zabrać głos? Po polsku czy po angielsku?
Unfortunately, I'll ask in English, but I think most of us who have heard of Charles Williams know of him through, well, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and the little that we know of Charles Williams is that he has had some sort of impact on C.S. Lewis. And I think we do see some of that impact here, like that character you talked about, that the Satanist, that Williams, I guess, narrator, if I understood correctly, sort of says has hope, is reminiscent of this character. My memory is failing me. I read the Chronicles of Narnia to my children years and years ago. What this last volume was, this apocalyptic one, and there's this soldier that fought Aslan, you know, together with this group, and then he's saved or something like that. So there, that element. So there seems to be a fair amount of that you can see how C.S. Lewis was inspired from, just from what you are saying here.
Yeah, I think it worked both ways, and there is a book about writers in community by Gliers, in which actually she tries to focus upon these common elements, and she's interested first of all in the influence, the impact that the Inklings exerted on one another or each other. So, you know, on the one hand, it may be true that, for example, Tolkien may not have liked certain works by Williams just maybe because of these occult trappings or occult elements in them. But on the other hand, they did discuss a number of books, and the last novel, All Hallows Eve, I mean, Williams used to read some parts of the novel to his fellow Inklings. So it was a kind of mutual impact, and I think there are some there is evidence that actually even Lewis decided to change something after it has been discussed. So it had been discussed. So I think it worked both ways. And as far as I remember, Williams also read the first sketches of The Lord of the Rings, and he commented upon it. So he had the chance of exchanging his ideas with Tolkien. There is a version according to which actually, you know, this Oxford period was the end of Williams's interest in the occult. That actually, because of he met these Christian intellectuals, he became fascinated with Christianity as represented by them. So I think it is evident in his last novel. All Hallows Eve is a different novel. It's more Christian and more inkling-like, if I can say so. Although there are some, we've got these magicians, we've got black magic, we've got the raising of the dead in a way, we've got creating a golem-like creature. This is really difficult to find words to describe it. But I believe that it was an important relationship for all of them. Personally, in terms of friendship, and especially between Lewis and Williams, and Williams and Lewis, but also among other inklings.
Sorry, I'm also in English. English. That was absolutely fascinating. I wanted to actually continue this inklingness because the last novel, the novel that you mentioned with the objects, it just struck me that the way that you're talking about the objects, like the Stone of Solomon, like the Grail, helps us to make sense of the One Ring in the sense that it's both good and both bad. And I wondered if you'd like to say something about objects.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there is a parallel here. Mm-hmm.
I will try to speak English. Sorry for my bad. Well, as you said, Williams is kind of forgotten and unwanted. And I find him, maybe it's because I don't know him well, I find comparing him to Tolkien and Lewis disgusting, or kind of. I feel he's like Paulo Coelho, who mixes together Christianity and some spiritual things like New Age. But that's not the point. My question is about real quality of Williams' books. It's not about if reading him gives a pleasure to someone, but about style and poetic values.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Now, I can understand this attitude because, I wouldn't use the word disgusting personally, but still it depends, I think a lot depends on your definition of Christianity. As a Catholic, I'm with you. But I think, I know that much about Anglican, High Church, Catholicism, theology, but there are many articles written by priests, Anglican priests, and actually they see nothing controversial as far as the essence, the dogmatic essence of what they understood by Christianity is concerned. So, it all depends on the perspective. From a Catholic perspective, I agree, it is possible to call him a kind of a prophet of New Age. But this is about the novels. But again, officially, he has the status of a lay theologian. So in his theological works, he is Christian, and absolutely, there is nothing occult whatsoever about them, or nothing controversial about them. But I was trying to in a way, to answer this through this quotation from Anthony, that we should remember about the time in which he lived. And, perhaps it was better at that time to raise these questions, to try and remind people that there is the other reality at all, than just not to do it. So that's the first part. Now, as far as the poetic or artistic quality of his works, this is also controversial because there are very good passages, there are really powerful, beautifully written scenes, and there are also problems. There are also, let's say, maybe not really mistakes, but kind of inconsistency in terms of when you think about the literary value of the novels. That's why some critics say we shouldn't use the name novels here, because these are idiosyncratic forms of artistic expressions, not really novels. Some people say his characters are flat. They are boring, nothing happens, and this is like, you know, the essence is these philosophical and religious ideas, but this literary surface is just an addition. Some other critics argue that just to the contrary, that these are well-developed characters, they are psychologically interesting, and you know, these opposite ideas, opposite commentaries are connected with every single book. So I think it's uneven. There are passages which really make him one of the greatest writers, probably modernist writers. Although you know, this is the kind of shortcut. But on the other hand, there are problems as a literary scholar. I do see these problems with how he develops his plots or his conflicts. Sometimes you've got you know, a resolution which is equivalent to what is called in Latin deus ex machina. So you know, the conflict is not really psychologically resolved, but rather there is a kind of supernatural intervention or mysterious intervention. But nonetheless, I think, I mean, his novels are interesting from my perspective, at least exactly because of these qualities. Because I'm interested in the reader's response. I'm interested in how interpretations are created. This is what cognitive poetics deals with. Not so much with the interpretations as such, but rather with how is it possible for us, conceptually and intellectually and emotionally, to be able to build up such interpretations. How is it possible to interpret one particular passage, either in terms of Christianity, and you know, there are critics who say this is essentially Christian, and there are critics who say, come on, this is paganism. This is like the promotion of the occult. So that's why I think his novels are an interesting object of study to me.
Maybe both possibilities are inside.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. It depends on what, you know, cognitive scholars talk about the frames of knowledge, which is a part of a scheme that a reader brings into a book during the process of reading. And Williams's texts are open in the sense that they've got a number of interpretative gaps. And it depends on what kind of frame you are using. And if you look at them from the perspective of Catholicism, then of course certain things are out of the question spiritually. But you know, this is really curious because there are totally occult interpretations of his books, and there is a memory doesn't serve me right today, but there is a critic who interprets even Tolkien and C.S. Lewis through alchemy and through occult concepts. So, you know, a lot depends on what you represent as a reader, as a critic, I think. Forgotten, cannot recall his name. Okay, anyway, sorry.
I heard about interpretation of Tolkien that is, I think, much more queer than what you said. So,
well,
question.
Anything goes. In
Yes,
literary
anything
criticism,
goes.
anything goes. That's another case.
One more point with this point that has just been brought up about whether we this kind of interpretation of Charles Williams and the difference between, let's say, his fiction and his theology, his later theology, if we put it that way. Speaking of Christian thinkers of this last period, then there was this famous statement by Dostoevsky, right? That if I have Christ on the one hand and truth on the other, then I choose Christ, right? And so this is almost the position that is elaborated here, whereas another controversial, let's say, Christian thinker, Simone Weil, put it, but, actually that's a contradiction in terms. If you follow the truth, even if it seems to be leading away from Christ, then the truth will eventually lead you to Christ. That slippery ground on both sides, but it talks about the difficulty of that type of journey, and there is a connection with the Inklings in that at least I've come across Tolkien making that distinction between the imagination, and I think he believed in the freedom of the imagination, and theological ideas, because he himself criticized, whether it was an accurate criticism or not, C.S. Lewis, of having more of kind of a dualist imagination, even though in his theological ideas he was above that. And here, since we are in John Paul II Collegium, I remember a comment that John Paul made on Czesław Miłosz, right? That whom he really appreciated, especially as we know from this letter that he wrote during the funeral of Czesław Miłosz, that you go 2 steps forward, and 1 step back. And that's the artistic, and Miłosz says, well, that's my artistic journey, right?
Yeah, for my own sake, I've made a distinction between, Christian and Christocentric. So I wouldn't call his novels Christocentric in the sense that you don't see Jesus Christ as a person. Jesus Christ is absent there. Well, Williams doesn't really use the name God. He uses, instead of God, he talks about some qualities of God quite often, like omnipotence, mercy. But on the other hand, well, as a Christian, again, although I do not quite approve of a number of his ideas, I think there is this essentially religious thinking into it. And if you follow certain paths, let's say, they make you think, ponder on particular dogmas, and it is helpful. Another fact is that Williams was in a way trained by his father in questioning Christian writers. I mean, they used to read a lot, his father and Charles, and they discussed these works. And the father encouraged Williams to ask all kinds of questions, even the questions which, are not supposed to be, or were not supposed to be asked. So, in a way, some critics say at least, his mind was dialectical, that he himself created or suggested things, but also at the same time asked hypothetical questions like, what would happen if, right? So I would say that quite often in his novels we've got this if logic, which doesn't have to be Williams's, and that's another thing, because as a literary scholar, I try not to forget about the fact that these are works of art, first of all, and not his philosophical or theological ideas. So my approach is slightly different. I think there should be a difference, from my perspective at least, There should be a difference between how you approach his theological texts or his critical texts and how you approach his fiction. Because fiction creates, first of all, I believe, aesthetic effect. So the rules are different. And although you cannot forget about Williams the person while reading the novels, I think even what his narrator says is not always what William may have thought.
Can I make a comment and then
Sure.
ask a different kind of question? The comment is that I think the reason why Anglicans are happier is that in the middle of the 20th century, particularly promulgated by liberal Catholic elements such as Archbishop William Temple, they have a very, very strong theology of, I don't want to call it nature, they have a kind of pan-sacramentalism, which you mentioned. And if you have a strong pan-sacramentalism, anything can be a sign that takes you to God, even ones that seem negative. And I'd given it as an example Dante's use in Inferno, where the damned paradoxically lead Dante to salvation. That's the first point. The second point is that people who want to make a big distinction with Lewis need to look at the adult fiction. If you read Lewis's science fiction trilogy, particularly volume 3, That Hideous Strength, it's full of magic, the marital theology, the goddess Venus, all sorts of stuff. But the question I have is a rather different one, which is that we've been thinking of him in terms of occultism and stuff like this. But a different reading might say, he's a thoroughgoing Platonist. Do you see him as a Platonist?
Right. I think it's possible. I think it's possible. This is like another interpretative path that. I think it is Neoplatonist, maybe like this. But I agree that. At least when you look at the novels, I don't know that much about poetry. Again, using the word occult or esoteric, because again, there are different understandings of it. But critics say that especially poetry, I mean, poetry is even more occult in that sense than the novels are. But I think, philosophically, I could agree with that personally, that it is a kind of Neoplatonism, and in that respect, he underlines the unity of the world, and what we see actually reflects the essence of all things. So in that, well, I think. These theological issues are quite complex. I don't feel qualified enough to discuss them here, especially. But you cannot escape it. You cannot escape it. Overall, I wouldn't call Williams a saint, as some people did, and certainly not in the sense of Tolkien's sainthood. That's a completely different story. Would I call him a mystic? I don't know. Certainly, his descriptions of these, I don't know how to call this kind of experience, parapsychological or quasi-supernatural or whatever. Like there are some descriptions of something which might be called an astral journey, for example. But again, it's very powerful, it's very convincing, but the question is, did Williams practice this? I don't know. Maybe, even in the case of, this is one of the gravest problems, like some people say because he described a black mass in the book War in Heaven, he describes a black mass. Again, a very powerful ritual in terms of literary qualities. makes you shudder in a way. And then they say, aha, William's the Satanist. He promotes Satanism. But again, only recently did I discover a text which actually describes these rituals in a similar way. So Williams may have used such texts. You know, he was involved in this esoteric society, whatever. So such descriptions functioned on the market, and it is hard to say. I think it doesn't make much sense from the literary perspective to try and decide whether he practiced these or not. In the book, they convey a very important function. And in the same novel, we've got both a description of the Black Mass and a beautiful description of a Christian liturgy. And the other one comes at the end of the book. So I would say the impression it creates, it makes, is much stronger than that. And people tend to focus on the Black Mass because it's kind of, fascinating. But in terms of language, in terms of ideas, in terms of imagery, this final description of Prester John celebrating the Eucharist, it's absolutely fascinating. It's amazing. So again, I think it's a kind of mistake just, to focus. It's a kind of prejudiced reading when you focus only on these dark elements.
To już chyba ostatnie pytanie.
First, let me confess that I am a total stranger to Williams's novels, so forgive me my rudimentary question, but when I think of Christianity, first that comes into my mind is a certain way of perceiving salvation in a human person. And can we find in his works something similar to Christian notion of salvation and person? Thank you. That's my two questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I would say yes and no, just like our former president. Why? Okay, maybe let me start with the negative. Why not? Because my understanding of Christianity is that you need Jesus Christ as a person to be saved. You become saved only through Jesus Christ. This is what I believe. But on the other hand, he does talk about salvation through love. And when you don't have the person of Jesus Christ in the novels, but you've got this idea of love in the sense of caritas, love which is open, which includes others, as opposed to the love of oneself. So in this sense, you have to co-inhere, you have to become a part of this net of love in order to be saved. So in this sense, yes. But if you think about it in, theological terms perhaps, then not exactly perhaps. But love is important, and in certain novels, love is capitalized. Williams capitalizes love. So you might interpret it, I think, as a quality. In one of the essays, Williams openly admits that he kind of hates religious discourse. He doesn't like using certain words and phrases. In other words, he says he prefers to talk about God, to talk about religion, to talk about Christianity without using, resorting to particular words and phrases. So maybe this is also a kind of answer to your question, that if you understand this love he writes about in terms of Christ, love as Christ, then yes. If it's something more general and less Christian, less Christocentric, then no. Sorry,
Excuse me, because the other part of my question was about a certain view of human being, because in Christianity we perceive humans as person, right, rational and free
yes,
beings.
here I think he absolutely he affirms our state. I mean, our beings as human beings. That is, he says we are both bodily creatures and spiritual creatures, and he draws attention to these two elements, and I think it's important because again, at that time there were many thinkers who tried to forget about this bodily component, who tried to focus only on our spiritual qualities. And Williams, in a way, in his theology of romantic love, but also in his novels, he draws attention to the importance of what we are. We as, parts of the creations, but we as creatures who consist of minds and bodies. And salvation or damnation is an individual decision. Again, I think he draws a lot of attention to this individual choice. It is up to us, really, and each moment is important. Each moment is important. Thank you.
Jak właśnie pan doktor powiedział, jesteśmy ludźmi cielesnymi i też ciało będzie potrzebowało trochę wytchnienia. We are bodily creatures and now our body needs rest, needs eat something. This second lunch I mentioned yesterday, so now we have time for this. Thank you very much. Dziękuję serdecznie wszystkim.
Jeszcze raz
Dziękuję.
bardzo Państwu dziękuję za zaproszenie. To był dla mnie duży przywilej i bardzo, bardzo się cieszę. Dziękuję Państwu.